Hello and welcome to Gwaii Haanas 2019. This is the coast of BC, on the wall of my study in Squamish. And here, across Hecate Strait from Prince Rupert, lies Haida Gwaii, which the locals call the edge of the world. For those of you who have seen my previous presentations, this is not going to be one of my typical 2 or 3 week solo expeditions, like the 2 trips shown here down the outside of Haida Gwaii. Nope, when 2 of my university friends, with whom I'd been on several canoe, kayak, and sailing trips in the past, suggested getting back together for a kayak trip, I didn't hesitate in suggesting a destination. This would be a buddy trip to one of the great bucket list destinations in the world, Gwaii Haanas, a trip to the protected southeast coast of Haida Gwaii. In the 1980s, as clear-cut logging was making its way down Moresby Island, the Haida Nation drew a line in the sand. That line today marks the boundary of Gwaii Haanas, whose full name is Gwaii Haanas National Park Reserve, Marine Conservation Area Reserve, and Haida Heritage Site. After logging was stopped, the Government of Canada wanted to make it a national park, but the Haida weren't prepared to give up their claim to the land. In the end, both sides wanted to protect it, so both sides agreed to disagree, and since 1993, Gwaii Haanas has been co-managed by Parks Canada and by the Haida Nation. For some of you, this video will be a trip down memory lane. For others, this trip may well be on your bucket list. So come on along to Gwaii Haanas. This is the GPS track of our trip. Starting at the north end of Gwaii Haanas, near the Haida Watchman site at Tanu. Another Haida Watchman site at Windy Bay. 3 days in the vicinity of Hot Spring Island. A side trip up an inlet. And ending at Burnaby Narrows for a total distance of 79.4 nautical miles, or 147 kilometers. June 21st, 2019, the longest day of the year. After a 2-day road trip from Squamish, here I am on the Northern Adventure, the ferry from Prince Rupert, approaching the coast of Haida Gwaii. There's the Northern Adventure, backed up to its dock at Skidegate Landing in Haida Gwaii. Unlike the rest of the BC Ferries fleet, there's only one way on or off this ship, so loading and unloading are a bit of a challenge. The small ferry that links the north and south halves of Haida Gwaii uses the ramp at the right. 5 minutes down the road is Spruce Point Lodge at the far side of the village of Queen Charlotte, which is seen here spreading along the north shore of Skidegate Channel. The airport is in Sandspit at the north end of Moresby Island, on the other side of the inlet. So on Sunday, June 23rd, I took the ferry from Skidegate Landing, across the inlet, to Sandspit, with the airport at its northeast point, on the sandy spit that gives Sandspit its name, where my buddies from Toronto flew in on the afternoon plane. Then we headed to the Sandspit Inn. So close to the airport that my buddies just pushed their gear over in airport luggage carts. That's Joe on the right and Hank on the left, and we're in the pub at the inn. It used to be operated by West Coast Resorts, a sports fishing lodge company, but since 2014, it's been run by the Sandspit Community Society, a non-profit community organization that also runs the visitor center at the airport, a fleet of 3 charter buses, and a number of other community services. Since the creation of Gwaii Haanas, Sandspit has been reinventing itself from a logging community to an ecotourism and sport fishing economy. On Monday morning, we headed back across the inlet to Skidegate and the Haida Heritage Center for our mandatory park orientations and to pick up our park trip permits. After the orientation, we toured the Heritage Center and the reserve at Skidegate, shopped for a few last-minute items, and headed back to Sandspit. On Tuesday morning, we headed over to the oceanfront in Sandspit, to the Seaport B&B, run by Moresby Explorers, where we met up with their van and drove 42 kilometers on logging roads to Moresby Camp at the head of Kumshawa Inlet, and quite literally the end of the road, where we would load aboard a Zodiac Hurricane for the 27 nautical mile ride to Kunga Island, near the northern boundary of Gwaii Haanas. These are our shipmates, a family from Kelowna in 2 double kayaks. That's the dad, Shane, on the left, the mum, Lisa, in the middle, and their 2 sons, Eric and Joel. And here's our nefarious crew, ready to rock. Heading out. After dropping us on the beach at Kunga Island, the Zodiac headed off to drop the family of 4 at Burnaby Narrows, while we set up camp among the trees. There had been a big blowdown here in 2012 that wiped out several of the tent sites. We found no sign of the pit toilet that is supposed to be here, so it must be under the blowdown. While we were setting up camp, this large catamaran, the Cascadia, showed up across the channel at Tanu. The Cascadia is new this year, and it's the largest tour boat operating in Gwaii Haanas, accommodating 24 guests at a time. Only 12 visitors can go ashore at a Watchman's site at a time, so the Cascadia takes up 2 tours at a time. The Haida Nation started its Watchman program in 1981, stationing watchmen at cultural sites throughout Haida Gwaii, both to protect the sites and give tours to visitors. There are 4 watchman sites within Gwaii Haanas, and we would visit 3 of them. Tanu, Windy Bay, and Hot Spring Island. When we called the Tanu watchman on Channel 6 to request permission to visit in an hour, she said that was fine. Cascadia was just wrapping up, and that would give her time to have supper. When we got there, Mary, the watchman, was waiting for us on the shore, next to a carved wood map of the village, showing house pits and the ruins of beams, posts, and poles.
So this is Chief Gifgun's house. The more wealth you had, the bigger house. You could see the beams are in the full round, so this was done before they had better...
Then it was back to camp for supper, and our first Gwaii Haanas sunset. Day 2 would have us cross the mouth of Richardson Inlet, then along the Lyle Island shore to a campsite near Dodge Point. Packing our boats for the first time. And ready to launch. Hank on the water. And me on the water. Calm seas as we crossed to Lyle Island. Lyell Island was the site of the 1980s blockades that stopped logging in Gwaii Haanas. And now, 34 years later, you can still see signs of clear cuts as the forests grow back. The campsite at Dodge Point is on an isthmus, with this beach on one side and this beach on the other. My campsite, Joe's campsite. Joe likes his comforts. And Hank, it seems, likes his discomforts. This is Hank's tent. You have to get into it by crawling backwards, and you can't sit up inside. Kitchen on a log. A fire below the tide line. Supper on the beach. And another beautiful sunset. Day 3 would take us around the northern tip of Lyell Island and down the open east coast to Windy Bay. Ready to launch? And heading around the north tip of Lyell. Sea cave number 1. Sea cave number 2. Hank playing hide and seek in the rocks.
Crunchy.
Arriving at Windy Bay with the legacy pole visible on shore.
Single Haida Gwaii, welcome good people to Hilkiak-Walga, Windy Bay.
This is Cliff, one of the 2 watchmen at Windy Bay. The watchman cabin. This is Looking Around and Blinking House, a longhouse that was built in the 1980s to house people during the logging blockade. And this is the legacy pole, which was raised in 2013 to celebrate 20 years of the Haida Nation and the Government of Canada co-managing Gwaii Haanas. Windy Bay is the only watchman site where you can camp, and we camped in the trees beside the creek just beyond the pole. Hank and I headed up the creek to filter water. Deer are an invasive species in Haida Gwaii, and with no natural predators, they have overrun the place. Meanwhile, Joe was making cocktails back in camp. It was raining lightly in the morning, so we headed inside the longhouse to make breakfast. This is the watchman's supply boat, making a delivery to Windy Bay. On day 4, we would paddle down the inside of a group of offshore islands to the Gap, a campsite on the northeast side of Murchison Island and close to Hot Spring Island. As we were leaving Windy Bay, people from tour boats and yachts were heading out under power to watch a pod of passing orcas. Unfortunately, we were too slow in our human-powered craft to catch up to the whales. The sun came out as we paddled past a chain of offshore islands. Coming into the Gap, a tombolo between Murchison Island and a smaller islet. A view of the tombolo with water in the channel. And the same view at low tide. We all know the importance of storing your boat above the high tide line, But Hank takes a different approach to what above means. Hank avoided putting my cook set on the open fire by cooking directly on a flat rock. Another lovely sunset and a morning tide pool. On day 5, we headed out through the gap, checked out the campsite at Clare Bay, stopped for a soak at Hot Spring Island, then back to our campsite at the gap. Launching, an eagle on the Murchison Island shoreline, and seals on the rocks. If you know my girlfriend Claire, you'll understand that I couldn't resist a visit to Clare Bay, and it turned out to be as lovely as she is. It has a beautiful south-facing beach and lovely tent sites in the trees. Approaching the south side of Hot Spring Island, with the watchman cabin and change rooms just above the beach. When we radioed to request permission to land, we were told that this beach was too rocky and we should go to a beach on the other side of the island. This is the Maple Leaf, a schooner that gives tours up the BC coast. We met some of the staff at the pools as they were leaving. Coming in to the beach on the other side of the island. We're used to seeing fishing floats used to mark trails, but this one is prettier than most. The trail across the island. Coming out past the watchman cabin, with the change rooms in the distance. And this is what it's all about. Here's Joe in the pools. Here's me in the pools. And Hank coming up to join us. The hot springs went cold after the 2012 earthquake, but they're back this year, and they're great. I might plan all my future trips around having a hot spring halfway through the trip. That's the Moresby Island coastline, across Juan Perez Sound, and you can see clouds from the exposed west coast spilling over the gaps. Heading back to our campsite at the Gap. A toast to a wonderful day. And a sunset fire below the tide line. On day 6, we moved camp from the Gap to the tip of Ramsey Island, poised for the crossing of Juan Perez Sound the next day. But still in close range of Hot Spring Island. Heading back out through the Gap. Striking across to Hot Spring Island. The sun coming out as we pass Hot Spring Island. Approaching Ramsey Point. And paddling a little way down the south side of Ramsey Island. To this beach, with what looked like a nice level bench behind it, in the trees for camping. Hank clearing a path through the kelp at the high tide line. Our campsites among the trees. Then it was back to Hot Spring Island for an evening soak. While we were there, we met a team of Parks Canada biologists who were monitoring a deer eradication program on Ramsey Island. Back to our campsite for dinner. Looks like Hank is having back bacon for dinner. If you have to wash up after dinner, this is where you want to do it. Day 7 was a 3.5 nautical mile crossing of Juan Perez Sound to a campsite just inside Hutton Inlet. Launching. Low cloud at the start of the crossing turned into fog. The fog got thicker at the same rate as we got closer to the other side, so we could just kind of make out where we were going. Coming into the beach at Hutton Inlet East. This is what happens when a couple of architects put up a tarp. Nice tent sites on the moss among the trees. A fire below the tide line, and a sort of sunset. Day 8 would be a bit of a rest day, with a day trip to the head of Hutton Inlet. So what do you do on a day off? You start with a bit of kayak porn, made from coffee filters and moon snail shells. Then you hike up the creek to filter water at a waterfall. That's my new platypus gravity filter, and I'm loving it. It's quick, painless, and it gives good water. Glad that we packed along bear spray. Ready to launch for our day trip. And heading across the mouth of Hutton Inlet to check out the campsite at Hutton Inlet West. Meanwhile, Joe was getting up close with a jelly. Then it was up the north side of the inlet. An outboard dinghy sped by. On its way back to these 3 power yachts anchored in the middle of the inlet. Approaching the head of the inlet, with more deer in the estuary meadows. Then it was turn around and back down the south side of the inlet. Joe and Hank went back to the campsite, while I paddled on 1 nautical mile down the coast to check out a campsite called Marco East. There's an older landslide on the nearby hillside. You may have noticed a number of landslides in this video. Landslides are a regular feature of the Haida Gwaii landscape. The land is just too steep. There's lots of rain, and the geology is so young. When I approached the campsite, it turned out to be occupied, so I didn't go ashore, and headed back to our campsite. Low tide the next morning. Day 9 would be our longest paddle, 14.9 nautical miles, as we were keen to spend a couple of nights near Burnaby Narrows and our pickup point. Launching. Our beach and the mouth of Hutton Inlet, with the sun coming out as we got going. Rock gardens. Returning to Marco East. The campers were out in their kayaks for the day. But I did encounter the people from the motor yachts in Hutton Inlet having lunch on the beach, with whom I exchanged stories. Marco East was one of the nicest campsites we saw on this trip. Another 1.5 nautical miles down the coast is Verner Point, and this is where we saw the campers from Marco East, fishing from their kayaks. Heading across Verner Bay, where we took a break on the last beach for a while. Otter tracks on the beach, paddling past the mouth of Marshall Inlet and Matheson Inlet, around Newbury Point and into Burnaby Strait. That's Huxley Island with the recent landslide, and looking down Burnaby Strait. That's Wanderer Island on the right, and Cat Island in the center, with Burnaby Narrows behind Cat Island. We had talked about camping on the south end of Wanderer, or on Cat Island. Cho had a smaller scale map that he'd picked up in Sandspit out in his chart case. These islands were shown a different color than the rest of Gwaii Haanas, and, most concerning, no little campsite icons were shown on them, while the others I'd marked on our charts were shown. The color looked closest to urban area, but that seemed unlikely, so it seemed like it must have been First Nations. Hank and I had both packed away our Gwaii Haanas visitor guides, so, exercising an abundance of caution, and with a ranger station only 2 nautical miles away and pretty much line of sight from both, we decided to head directly across Burnaby Strait to a campsite called Burnaby Island West, bathed in the evening sun. It's a decent campsite, and Hank, once again, stored his kayak above the high tide, but in his own inimitable style. When I unpacked my kayak and checked the map in my visitor's guide, it turned out that camping was not, in fact, prohibited on Cat and Wanderer Island. Note to future Steve, when you have a map showing prohibited camping areas, keep it on deck in your chart case. Sunset with broken cloud. The main event on day 10 was a day trip to Burnaby Narrows, also known as Dolomite Narrows. We had planned on being at the Narrows at low tide, but after yesterday's big paddle, there were some tired bodies kicking around camp this morning, and we didn't launch until low tide. Arriving at the Narrows about an hour later. Burnaby Narrows is known for its prolific intertidal life. Here are some underwater shots, courtesy of Joe's waterproof camera. That looks like a piece of inner tube, but it's a moon snail egg case. This guy had come down to feast on the intertidal banquet. Raccoons are another invasive species, introduced in the Great Depression in an attempt to improve the fur trade. In the 1970s, the banks of Burnaby Narrows were occupied by back-to-the-landers. But now there is no camping allowed on the banks, and you are asked to stay in your boats. If the 1980s logging blockades hadn't been successful, Burnaby Narrows had been slated to become a log dump. Afterwards, Joe headed back to the campsite, while Hank and I checked out some campsites around Burnaby Narrows, including Cat Island. Cat Island looked nice, a beautiful tombolo, with nice camping on the tombolo, and a good location for the pickup the next day. We decided it was nice enough to warrant switching camps. So we headed across the strait to collect Joe. And returned to Cat Island. To set up camp and enjoy our last campfire, watching the sunset. Our last morning in Gwaii Haanas, and look at the tide line from the night before. This is low tide. That's what makes camping on tombolos so cool. There are upland sites on the islet, so this would still be a good site at spring tides. Packed up and waiting for pickup by Moresby Explorers. The other folks on the Zodiac are the party of 5 who were camped at Marco East. That's Philip from Moresby Explorers shoving us off. These Zodiac hurricanes really get up and go. That's Carice at the helm. Full speed through Louise Narrows. And back to Moresby Camp to unload and drive back to Sandspit. We had a great trip to Gwaii Haanas. Great weather and long days at the end of June, calm seas, hot springs, great campsites, and over 11 days in Gwaii Haanas, we only saw 2 other groups of kayakers, the family we zodiaced in with and the group from Marco East that we zodiaced out with.